Well, I did it again, obviously. Again, I'm pretty upset by this. So this will be part three. Um, okay. Clerical celibacy. Gregory the Seventh, 11th century, tried to establish it throughout the hierarchy. Um, and so, the terms of these sacraments in 1215 were established. Either you could be married or you could be ordained, one of the two. So those were the ideas. But it took individuals from birth through death, and that was all related to salvation and damnation. Now, there was some exceptions in some ways to the rule. Um, Technically speaking, at least early on, you could become a monk and not be married and not be ordained. The whole development of Christian monasticism is a long and complex one. This is simply an issue here of going through a number of points in the development very quickly because Christian asceticism arose early on. Also in adopting a lot of these ascetical practices from Greek philosophy. Ascesis is the Greek term for asceticism, and that means actually disciplining yourself. And ascesis was translated into Latin as disciplina, as discipline, self discipline. And we'll be coming back to these issues as well. But monasticism in general went along two lines: the active life and the contemplative life. The active life was taking care of people, um, living in community. The contemplative life was more the being a hermit. We'll come back to that later as we go as well. But we have here the Cenobitic and the Anchoritic monasticism. The Cenobitic was living in communities, and the Anchoritic was being a hermit. And yet these two kind of fused and joined, as did the Vita Activa and the Vita Contemplativa. The Vita Activa became associated with being a priest in society, the care of souls, the cura animarum. If you were a priest, hearing confessions, in charge of a parish, or a bishop, you were involved in the active life. You were working with the people, whereas the contemplative life was the monastic life, removed from the people. It began to be from early on, dispensations were granted so that monks could be ordained. This was also a problem because talking about these three orders, ordos, the three orders, those who worked, those who fought, and those who prayed, or those who prayed and those who fought. We also have another distinction: the ordo monasticus, or being a monk, the ordo clericus, being a member of the clergy, or the ordo laicus, being a member of the laity. But yet we start having monks who were clerics and priests. And so there's problems there as well. That starts around in the earlier dispensations, but beginning in the 12th century, especially 11th, 12th century, begins to be whole new groups of monastics who were also priests or canons and everything else. So it becomes very messed up, so to speak. And then in the 13th century, new monastic groups form called the Mendicants, Franciscans, Dominicans, and then a little bit later, the Augustinian Hermits. As a mendicant group that was by definition directed to the cities, directed to preach and minister to the people, as were the Franciscans and the Dominicans as well. Whereas the Benedictines, as a monk, were to withdraw from society. Even as they would pray for society, their idea would be to withdraw from society. The mendicants were sent into the cities by definition, and they were ordained and they were educated. And for the Augustinians, anyway, they also viewed themselves as monks or as hermits, um, joining the active life and the contemplative life. And actually, we'll see that Jordan of Quedlinburg, someone you'll become familiar with, defined the contemplative life differently than anyone had previously. It included anything to do with contemplation. It included teaching and preaching, which had always been seen as part of the active life. But for Jordan, they're part of the contemplative life. And we'll come back to that when we get there. Um, Then we have up there the rule of St. Augustine, the rule of St. Benedict, the authority of bishops, the regular and secular clergy, the monastic schools of learning. In short, all of that is to point out to the rule of St. Augustine is an important rule for our story. We'll talk more about that as we go along. It actually predates the rule of St. Benedict, which the monks follow, the Benedictine orders follow. Both the Dominicans follow the rule of St. Augustine, the Augustinian canons follow the rule of St. Augustine, and the Augustinian hermits would follow the rule of St. Augustine. Another issue about these new monastic orders, such as the Mendicants too, they were outside of the authority of bishops. Like the communes or the free imperial cities, they were directly under the Pope. The Benedictines, or the monks, the Benedictine monastics, were underneath the authority of the bishops. But the mendicants were outside that hierarchical structure. They were directly responsible to the Pope, which is another important factor to keep in mind as we look at the developments there. And I have there the monastic schools as centers of learning and preserving classical tradition. They were from early on, and they continued to be centers of learning, and especially with the rise of the universities in the late 12th and 13th centuries. The Franciscans and Dominicans very quickly became some of the leading theologians, leading scholars at the universities. With the Augustinians, they were not founded until 1256, the Augustinian hermits. They were founded by the Pope in 1256. They did not get their first chair of theology at the University of Paris until Giles of Rome in 1287, I think it was. That's going to be an important story for us as we go forward. So they're learned orders, they're pastoral orders trying to affect the people, they establish their own churches within cities. And this was to cause great strain with the parish clergy. And we'll be talking about some of those issues next week in the lecture. But that, I think, will conclude now part 3, of this lecture on basic structures that will lead us to, I hope, have a bit of background to understand some of the developments that we'll be seeing next week and in the weeks to come, both in the later Middle Ages and on when we get to the 16th century, looking at how these basic structures and institutions and concepts and myths were to be reformed in the developments that we'll be looking at. Now, again, whether this will constitute a revolution is for you to answer in your final exam. But I thought we needed some sort of a common understanding of the background before jumping right in and talking about it. And so this is, in my view, a very important lecture in all 3 parts. To understand the developments, the Duchy of Saxony, the Electorate of Saxony, that's going to be huge. The empire and the emperor is going to be huge. The ecclesiastical and lay hierarchies are going to be huge, and the sacraments are going to be very important, as is even manorialism and manor life and the life of peasants. The rise of cities will be important for our story, especially the free imperial cities. And we'll see how all this comes together. But without some of these basic structures of Christendom, we cannot understand how Christendom was to be reformed in the Reformation. That's where I've spent the time on it that I have. My apologies for the mishaps for the part 3 section of lecture 2, but I hope they will all come out in the wash, so to speak, if that means anything to anybody that's saying. So I will get these posted in order eventually. And we'll go on the next week to talk about, I believe it is the first lecture next week, deals with the crisis of the later Middle Ages. And I'll be dealing with many of these issues again as they come to a head, so to speak, in the 14th century, when Europe really starts to enter a phase of crisis as never before. That's where we are headed. This is the background. And again, my apologies for the technical difficulties. I'll try not to do that next time. But I can't promise. I just said I'll try. I promise to try, but I can't promise that it won't happen again. But we'll go from there and make do. Okay. Thanks so much. Bye.